Yeah. Well, here we are. Thanks, of course, to Mick and Martin for inviting me to this workshop here today and to speak about George Kubler. As many of you will know, and we've heard we've heard the name at least this morning in the paper. During the last decade or so, George Kubler, and especially his 1962 essay, The Shape of Time, rose to a sudden prominence and became one of the most discussed art historical texts. His work was hailed as a methodological forerunner for diverse current tendencies in art historical research, such as world art studies or material culture studies. Kubler's revolutionary book, as Avinoam Shalem called it, was credited having invented a wholly new art historical methodology. The innovative aspect of his work was especially seen in his attempt to write a history of things, as already announced by the book's subtitle. Kubler writes, "It is as if things generated other things in their own images," and speaks of the reproductive powers appearing to reside in things. Consequently, thus, he marginalizes the artist, who is, well, reduced to a mere human intermediary who, so to say, acts out what the things dictated to him. In the following, I want to discuss briefly how Kubler describes, or in the terminology of this session's abstract, constructs time, and what role these very things actually play in this construction. Above all, Kubler argues against a narrative of art history as a succession of coherent periods and styles coming to life one after another, in the vein of popular cyclical models of art history, most prominently embodied by books such as Heinrich Wölflin's Principles of Art History, who argues that there was a perpetual succession of linear and painterly styles in the history of art, as represented, for example, here by Renaissance and Baroque art, and that this is, well, a law that underlies the evolution of art. Here, the same more or less illustrated in a more diagrammatic version in the book by Paul Ligeti. Kubler, on the contrary, states that the biological metaphor of style as a sequence of life stages was historically misleading, for it bestowed upon the flux of events the behavior and the shape of organisms. The latter, he argues, is fundamentally inadequate. The history of artistic problems and their subsequent solutions is much more disjointed and manifold than the classical art historical narrative of the evolution of different styles concedes. As he writes, the biological model was not the most appropriate one for a history of things. Perhaps a system of metaphors drawn from physical science would have clothed the situation of art more adequately than the prevailing biological metaphors. Michael Faraday might have been a better mentor than Linnaeus for the study of material culture. Whilst the biological metaphors of rise, blossoming, and decay of a style indicate a rather linear and uninterrupted chain of events, the language of electrodynamics that he proposes to use enables the art historian to describe more intricate processes of transmission. According to this metaphorical model, objects and artworks emit impulses which are then redirected by relays, blocked by resistances, or collected in a kind of energy node. The connections between the respective links of this chain don't have to be directly related. Impulses can readily bridge large geographical distances, but also long historical intervals. This leads, according to Kubler, to a narrative of art history that focuses on linked series of solutions composing a sequence, on series of replications, as he calls it, working on a shared problem. This results in a model of history which is far more dynamic and incoherent than the usual art historical narrative of, say, a history of style. To give a concrete example discussed in the text, Cézanne, for example, here in the bottom right corner, is understood as the receiver of such an impulse, namely the artistic problem of luminous structure of landscape. That was then transmitted to his time and place, to Cézanne's time, from Pompeian mural painting via landscape painting of the 17th century. Take, for example, a Claude as an example. This might hint to one peculiarity of Kubler's history of things, namely that it's not necessarily very thingly, to borrow the title of the next session. Describing artworks not, to use the biological set of metaphors, as grown organisms, but rather as nodes, collecting energetic impulses, more or less disembodies the objects. The history of things thus becomes a story of dematerialized impulses, not material contacts. To stick with our example, the 17th century landscape painter knew, after all, nothing about the Roman frescoes in Pompeii. On the other hand, this leads to the somewhat surprising conclusion that Kubler's history of things operates without any notion of, say, traveling things, or immediate contact between objects. The impulses which the objects emit bridge geographical regions, not the objects themselves. Consequently, the term spolia doesn't appear at all during the course of Kubler's essay. Maybe this was precisely the aspect of Kubler's book that made it so interesting for artists like Robert Smithson, whose theory gravitates precisely around such terms as dematerialization, as you all know, most prominently forward by Lucy Lippard's book 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 72. The flux of energy, and namely its transmissions between different media, was one of the main topics of Smithson's art. A perfect example for this logic might be Smithson's text Entropy Made Visible. Speaking about the consummation of energy in thermodynamic systems, Kubler compares the principle of entropy to the nursery rhyme of Humpty Dumpty, then subsequently to Watergate, and then to Marcel Duchamp in the end. So he makes seemingly nonsensical connections, most probably, or so current research argues at least, in order to construct a text that precisely imitates, in its own structure and in its illogical narrative, the principle of entropy and the spontaneous transfer of energy from one system to another. However, back to Kubler. In the course of his description of art historical time according to the model of energy transmission, one thing remained unclear. Where do these impulses that spark the generation of new things originate? Where do they come from, and what are they exactly? Rather mysteriously, Kubler writes that a continuous series runs from the oldest surviving things, as for example stone tools, to the things of today, and that everything made now is either a replica or a variant of something made a little time ago, and so on, back without break to the first morning of human time. This question is even more pressing as Kubler apparently describes the replications of artworks as sequences of solutions, working on a shared problem, as, for example, the set luminous landscape, which is solved by a painter like Cézanne, or who tries to solve this problem. All these solutions, however, are thus not merely accidental, as, say, the entropic transmission of energy caused by, say, melting ice cubes in a glass of water, but are apparently meaningful, as serving a purpose. Kubler readily admits that he carefully sidestepped that questions where these problems, or the want for their solution, come from. In the second chapter of Shape of Time, however, he nevertheless tries to elucidate the question of the origin of artistic sequences. Here, he introduces a class of object that he names prime object, a term coined in analogy to prime numbers, which means basically an undividable holistic innovation. Already the name might indicate a rather numinous rather than a rational phenomenon. Kubler's definition of the prime object confirms this impression. His original entities are characterized as enigmatic, as escaping regulation and a proper definition. On top of that, they seem to appear quasi all of a sudden. No antecedents explain their enigmatic, innovative qualities. As examples for such prime objects, Kubler names several masterpieces of European arts, works, as he writes, in the category of the Parthenon or the portal statues at Reims or the frescoes by Raphael in the Vatican. Not that they wouldn't have any precursors at all, quite the contrary. The Parthenon, for example, is described as a retarded example of the peripteral temple. Its enigmatic status as a prime is only defined by the many refinements lacking in the other temples of its series. The prime object that seems to be something like a culmination or turning point of special importance and kind of ends an old series of replications, making a leap forward and thus introducing a new artistic innovation that then becomes a problem for subsequent generations to solve. Such a reference to many refinements is, of course, incredibly vague. And this vagueness forces Kubler to do something that he originally didn't want to do. To define the sketchy hot moment of invention, as he calls it, Kubler falls for the very terminology that he had discarded earlier. He uses organic and biological metaphors to describe the nature of the prime object. It differs, he writes, from an ordinary object much as the individual bearer of a mutant gene differs from the standard example of that species. The mutant gene might be infinitesimally small, but the behavioral differences which it occasions can be very great indeed. Compared to what I've quoted so far, the indefiniteness of this decisive revolutionary innovation is even increased by such a definition. Incredibly small it is what discriminates the prime object from the rest of the series. And it differentiates itself from the rest of the series by a mutant gene, as he calls it, which rather seems to be a je ne sais quoi than an objective, graspable quality. Consequently, Kubler describes the nature of the prime object somewhat ambiguously. Even though he names concrete examples for such primes whose prime status is unquestionable, he also writes that the true innovation is only incompletely manifested by prime objects or things of great generating power. Strictly considered, he writes, the hot moment of invention exists only as an idea. The origin of the history of things thus becomes once again dematerialized. Here, Kubler's notion of artistic innovation apparently approaches a rather classical topos of the artistic idea, the mental creation regarded as opposed and privileged over the material realization of the artwork. Just show you the cover of Panofsky's famous essay, Idea, which is all about this problem, idea versus matter. This, of course, this idea, harks back to another concept that Kubler dismissed together with the biological metaphors, namely the notion of artistic genius. The artist, we remember, was described merely as a human intermediary, as transmitter of the signals sent out by the objects themselves. However, after discussing the nature of the prime object, Kubler concludes the chapter with a paragraph on solitary and gregarious artists. Here, Kubler puts forward the thought that great art can only be created by the first type, the solitary artist. The outstanding innovator among artists like Caravaggio, nevertheless, is functionally lonely. His break with tradition may or may not be known to the multitude, but he is himself of necessity aware of the isolation it brings. Usually, the entire range and bearing of such a career can be brought into focus only long after death, when we can place it in relation to preceding and subsequent events. Probably all important artists belong to this functionally lonely class. Artistic innovations in the proper sense of the word are thus to be understood as a break with all the momentary conditions and the fate of birth that the respective artist would have been normally subdued. In this respect, Kubler writes, artistic innovations resemble modern mathematical systems in the freedom with which their creators discarded certain conventional assumptions and replaced them with others. The comparison to mathematics as a discipline based largely on purely intellectual, immaterial conventions is quite telling. The mutant gene responsible for the leap forward that's constituted by prime objects seems not the least to be located in the artist himself. Kubler elaborates these indications on the nature of artistic invention further in the fourth chapter of his book, where he develops a typology of artists' lives. This typology proves what one might have already concluded from the description of the lonely artist and his abilities. Kubler connects artistic innovation intimately with the romantic idea of a rebellious, unrecognized, and precisely due to these character traits, visionary artist. We have already encountered the lonely spirit whose revolutionary resistance against the contemporary conditions predestines him for being a great artist. As his pendant, Kubler presents, for example, the type of proleptic artist, or the precursor. Michelangelo and Phidias are named as examples for this type. Their innovative power gains an almost prophetic, predestined quality. While most of the artists have little choice but to move from the position just gained to the next position, personalities as Michelangelo prefigure in a work of a few years the series that several generations will slowly and laboriously evolve. They, Michelangelo and co., are able by an extraordinary feat of the imagination to anticipate a future class of forms in relatively complete projection. As further examples for this type of an artist-historical precursor, he names, for example, Claude Nicolas Ledoux, whose neoclassical use of the forms of pure geometry under Napoleon prefigured the hard abstractions of the international style in the 20th century, or Sir Joseph Paxton, whose prefabrication of metal parts allowed him to design the prophetic spaces of glass and steel in Crystal Palace in London. To achieve such innovations, one needs apparently a high degree of unconventionality and a willingness to break with tradition. Less gifted contemporaries might thus regard these prophetic works as a dangerous departure from routine or as an unconsidered lapse into the unknown, and judge them thus to be a lapse of propriety surrounded by the frightening aura of a violation of the sanctity of routine. Kubler's conclusion, following these, to put it mildly, very romantic cliches on originality and unrecognized geniality, is finally that both in science and in art, the inventive behavior rejected by the mass of people has become more and more the prerogative of a handful who live at the crumbling edge of convention. Precursors, doing prophetic works, prefiguring and anticipating future solutions. These types of people seem to produce the type of works that then emit, so to say in Kubler's language, the electrical impulses, sparking a series of replications of the groundbreaking model that they establish. The prime object seems to be little more than an alias for what other authors thus might have called genius. Again, and this is my conclusion, it becomes evident that Kubler's history of things is a fundamentally disembodied, dematerialized narrative, whose scientific metaphors, taken from the realm of electrodynamics, might rebrand traditional concepts of artistic originality, but remain nevertheless indebted to an immaterial art history of ideas. Thank you very much.